The dust swirled across the parched street like a restless ghost as Penelope Turner stared at the unopened telegram in her trembling hands. After 6 months without a word from her husband, this thin piece of paper might confirm what her heart already suspected, that Matthew would never again cross the threshold of their small home on the edge of Silver Creek, Colorado. The year was 1878, and Silver Creek had sprung up around the promise of riches hidden within the nearby mountains. Men came with dreams of striking it rich, and some, like Penelope's husband, never returned from the shadowy depths of the mines that dotted the jagged landscape. Penelope took a deep breath and broke the seal, her eyes scanning the words that would forever alter her life. Regret to inform you, collapse in the Silver Star mine, no survivors recovered, deepest condolences. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, and the telegram fluttered to the floor of the post office. Mrs. Turner, are you all right, madam? The postmaster's voice seemed to come from miles away. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the small post office closed in around her as she clutched her chest, gasping for air that wouldn't come. 23 years old, and now a widow, alone in a town that existed only because men like her husband believed in dreams buried deep underground. Strong hands steadied her as she swayed. Easy now, madam. Take a seat here. The voice was deep, unfamiliar, but somehow reassuring. Penelope allowed herself to be guided to a wooden chair near the window. When her vision cleared, she found herself looking up into the concerned face of a stranger, tall and broad-shouldered. With sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky, he regarded her with genuine concern. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "No need for thanks. Anyone would do the same." He knelt beside her chair, keeping his voice low. "Bad news, I take it?" Penelope nodded, unable to voice the terrible truth. To say it aloud would make it real, and she wasn't ready for that reality just yet. The stranger picked up the fallen telegram and handed it back to her without reading it. "My name's Ethan Quinn. I just rode into town looking for work." "Penelope Turner," she replied automatically, the social graces her mother had instilled in her taking over where conscious thought failed. "My husband, he—" The words caught in her throat. "The mines," Ethan said softly, understanding in his eyes. "I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Turner." The postmaster approached with a glass of water. "Mrs. Turner, if there's anything you need—" "Thank you, Mr. Phillips," she said, taking the glass with hands that still trembled. "I should get home." "I'll help you to your wagon," Ethan offered, standing and offering his arm. Penelope hesitated only a moment before accepting. The simple act of standing felt monumental, as though her body had aged decades in the span of minutes. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street. The ordinary bustle of the town continued around them. The general store still did business. The saloon's piano played a jaunty tune, and horses stamped impatiently at hitching posts. Yet for Penelope, everything had changed. "My wagon is just there." She pointed to a small buckboard with a bay mare harnessed to it. "Allow me," Ethan said, helping her onto the seat before untying the reins. "Where to, Mrs. Turner?" "I can manage from here, Mr. Quinn," Penelope said, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. "But thank you for your kindness." Ethan nodded respectfully, handing her the reins. "If you're certain, though it seems to me you shouldn't be alone just now." For a moment, Penelope considered accepting his offer. The thought of returning to an empty house, of facing the reality of her loss alone, was almost unbearable. But she squared her shoulders. I need to be alone to think." "Of course." Ethan stepped back from the wagon. "I expect I'll be around town for a while, if you find yourself in need of assistance." With a nod, Penelope flicked the reins and turned the wagon toward home. The telegram a heavy weight in her pocket. The small cabin that she and Matthew had built together sat on an acre of land just outside town. The vegetable garden she had tended so carefully was beginning to wither in the summer heat, much like her hopes for the future they had planned together. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been that morning when she'd left for town. Matthew's coat still hung by the door, as if waiting for him to return and claim it. His pipe sat on the mantel, and the book he'd been reading lay open on the table, a pressed flower marking his place. Reminders of a life interrupted, of promises unfulfilled. Penelope moved through the cabin in a daze, touching these remnants of her husband as if to convince herself that he had been real, that their brief marriage had not been merely a dream. They had been married just 2 years, and now she was alone. That night, she didn't bother lighting the lamps. She sat in the darkness, replaying memories of Matthew, his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how his hands, rough from working in the mines, would stroke her cheek with surprising gentleness. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell asleep in Matthew's chair, clutching his coat to her chest. The following days passed in a blur. Neighbors brought food she couldn't eat and offered condolences that couldn't penetrate her grief. She went through the motions of living, feeding the chickens, tending what remained of the garden, replying to concerned inquiries with assurances that she was managing. But inside, a hollowness grew, a space where hope and joy had once resided. A week after receiving the telegram, Penelope found herself staring at the meager contents of her pantry. Matthew had always handled their finances, and she had little idea of their situation. What little savings they had would not last long, and she needed to make decisions about her future. "Mrs. Turner," a voice called from outside, followed by a knock on the door. "Mrs. Turner, it's Ethan Quinn. I've brought some supplies from town." Penelope opened the door to find Ethan standing on her porch, his arms laden with packages. "Mr. Quinn, I didn't ask for any supplies." "No, madam, you didn't," he agreed, his expression serious beneath the brim of his hat. "But Mrs. Henderson at the general store mentioned you hadn't been in for a while, and I thought you might be running low on essentials." Penelope felt a flicker of irritation amidst her grief. "I don't need charity, Mr. Quinn." "It's not charity, Mrs. Turner. Consider it a loan, if you prefer, or payment in advance." "Payment for what?" "I heard you were skilled with needlework. I've got shirts that need mending, and I've never had the knack for it myself." He shifted the packages in his arms. "May I come in? These are getting heavy." Penelope hesitated, then stepped aside. It wasn't proper to allow a strange man into her home, but the rules that had once governed her life seemed trivial now in the face of her loss. Ethan set the packages on her table: flour, coffee, sugar, salt pork, and other basics. "I also brought these." He pulled out several worn shirts from his saddlebag. "If you're willing, of course." Penelope examined the shirts. They did indeed need mending, with torn seams and missing buttons. "I can fix these," she said, her fingers automatically assessing the work needed. "But this is far more than the mending would cost." "Then perhaps you can help me with something else as well," Ethan said, removing his hat and running a hand through his sandy hair. "I've taken a job at the livery stable in town, and I've been offered the use of a small cabin behind it, but it needs a woman's touch to be habitable. Curtains, perhaps, and some advice on making it less like a place where they used to store hay." Penelope caught a glimpse of understanding in his eyes. He was creating reasons to help her while preserving her dignity. "Mr. Quinn." "Ethan, please." "Ethan," she amended. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes drifting to the window, to the mountains that had claimed her husband. "I lost my wife and son to fever 3 years ago in Kansas," he said finally. "I know something about grief and how hard it can be to simply breathe through it. Sometimes having a purpose, no matter how small, helps." The simple honesty in his words struck a chord in Penelope. "I'm sorry for your loss." "And I for yours." He put his hat back on. "I'll come by in a few days for the shirts, if that's all right. And perhaps you can tell me then if you're willing to help with the cabin." After he left, Penelope stood in the middle of her kitchen, the packages of food on the table and the shirts draped over a chair. For the first time since receiving the telegram, she felt a faint stirring of purpose. She would mend the shirts, and she would help with the cabin, not because she needed the charity, but because Ethan Quinn was right. She needed to breathe again. The next morning, Penelope woke with a clearer head than she had in days. She made coffee, strong the way Matthew had liked it, and sat at the table with Ethan's shirts. The repetitive motion of needle and thread was soothing, and she found herself thinking about Ethan's words. He had lost his family too. Yet here he was, building a new life in Silver Creek. There was something reassuring about knowing someone else had walked this path of grief before her and survived. By midday, she had finished mending the shirts and decided to walk into town. The fresh air and exercise might clear her mind, and she needed to face the community eventually. Silver Creek was bustling with the usual midday activity when Penelope arrived. She kept her head high as she passed familiar faces, acknowledging their greetings and condolences with quiet dignity. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson greeted her warmly, expressing relief at seeing her out and about. "That Mr. Quinn seems like a good sort," Mrs. Henderson commented as she wrapped a small piece of hard candy for Penelope, refusing payment with a wave of her hand. "Said he knew what it was like to lose someone. He's taken over for old Pete at the livery, and from what I hear, the horses already prefer him." "He seems kind," Penelope agreed, accepting the candy with thanks. "A widow needs friends," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes softening with understanding. "And sometimes a widow needs more than friends, given time." Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mrs. Henderson, I've only just learned of Matthew's passing." "Of course, dear. I didn't mean to suggest—" "Well, it's just that life goes on, doesn't it? It has to." The older woman patted her hand. "You're young, Penelope. Remember that." As Penelope left the store, she caught sight of Ethan across the street, leading a magnificent black stallion from the livery. He hadn't seen her yet, and she paused to watch him work. There was a quiet confidence in his movements, a gentleness in how he handled the spirited horse. The animal seemed to respond to him, calming under his touch. Just then, Ethan looked up and saw her. He raised a hand in greeting, and Penelope found herself returning the gesture before continuing on her way, a curious lightness in her step that she immediately felt guilty for experiencing. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and pink, Penelope tried to reconcile her feelings. Grief for Matthew still dominated her heart, but she couldn't deny the comfort she'd found in Ethan's kind gesture. Was it disloyal to accept help from another man? To find solace in the company of someone who understood her pain? She remembered her father's words after her mother's death, when Penelope was just 16. "The heart is not a vessel with limited capacity, Penny. It expands to hold what it needs." 3 days later, Ethan returned for his shirts. Penelope had not only mended them, but had also reinforced seams that were beginning to wear and replaced buttons that were loose. She'd even pressed them with the flat iron, something she knew from her own husband's appreciation was a small luxury for a working man. "These look better than when they were new," Ethan said, examining her work. "You have a real talent, Mrs. Turner." "Penelope," she corrected him, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "If I'm to call you Ethan, it's only fair." They sat at her kitchen table, and Penelope found herself asking about his work at the livery, about the town from a newcomer's perspective, about anything that didn't involve mines or grief or the uncertain future. "Have you thought about my other proposal?" Ethan asked after a while. "About helping with the cabin?" "I have," Penelope said, setting down her cup. "I'd be happy to help. It would give me purpose." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I thought it might. The cabin isn't much, but it's solid. Just needs some touches to make it a home rather than just a place to sleep. I'd like to see it, if that would be all right." "Of course. Whenever you feel up to it." The next day, Penelope hitched her mare to the wagon and drove into town. The livery stable was at the far end of the main street, a large weathered building with corrals extending behind it. The smell of hay, horses, and leather filled the air as she approached. Ethan was in one of the corrals, working with a young colt. He looked up as she arrived, a smile breaking across his face. "Penelope, I didn't expect you today." "I decided there was no point in waiting," she replied, securing her horse. "I'd like to see this cabin that needs a woman's touch." Ethan led her behind the livery to a small structure nestled against a stand of cottonwood trees. It was indeed small, just one room, with a stone fireplace, a small window, and a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, the space was clean but sparse. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, a small table and chair occupied the center of the room, and a few hooks on the wall held Ethan's spare clothes. The fireplace showed signs of recent use, and a coffee pot sat on a makeshift shelf beside it. "It's not much," Ethan said, watching her reaction, "but the roof doesn't leak, and it's warm enough at night." Penelope walked slowly around the small space, already seeing possibilities. "The door needs to be rehung," she said practically. and curtains would certainly help. Perhaps a rug for the floor. She turned to face him. It has potential. That's more than I saw in it, Ethan admitted with a chuckle. To me, it was just a place that wasn't a bedroll under the stars. Have you been traveling long? Penelope asked, curious about this man who had appeared in Silver Creek just when she needed someone who understood her pain. 3 years, he replied, leaning against the doorframe. After Sarah and little James died, I couldn't stay in our home. Too many memories. So I started drifting, taking work where I could find it, ranches mostly, some cattle drives. Never stayed in one place more than a few months. What made you stop here? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze directed out the door toward the mountains. Honestly, I'm not sure. I was passing through on my way to California, but something about this place. Maybe I was just tired of running. Or maybe the mountains reminded me that some things endure, no matter what storms come their way. His words resonated with Penelope. She, too, had drawn comfort from the mountain's steady presence during her darkest moments of grief. Well, she said, bringing her thoughts back to the task at hand, I can make curtains from some fabric I have at home, and I might have a small rug I can spare. She glanced at the crooked door. As for the door, I'm afraid that's beyond my abilities. I can manage the door, Ethan assured her. It's the homey touches I have no skill for. Then we have an agreement, Penelope said, extending her hand formally. You fix the door, I'll provide the homey touches. Ethan took her hand, his much larger one engulfing hers. His palm was rough with calluses, much like Matthew's had been. But there was a gentleness in his grip that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Agreement, he said, his blue eyes holding hers for a moment before releasing her hand. Over the next week, Penelope found herself occupied with projects for Ethan's cabin. She sewed simple curtains from spare fabric, gathered a few cooking utensils she could part with, and found a small rug that would fit beside his bed. The work kept her hands busy and her mind focused on something other than her loss. She visited the cabin several times, each visit extending a little longer than the previous one, as she and Ethan fell into easy conversation. He told her stories of his travels, of the characters he'd met on the trail, and of the beauty he'd seen across the Western Territories. In return, she shared memories of her childhood in Missouri, of her journey west with her parents, and of building a life in Silver Creek. Carefully, they circled around their deepest grief, touching on it only briefly, acknowledging its presence without allowing it to overwhelm their growing friendship. One evening, as summer gave way to early autumn, Penelope arrived at the cabin to find Ethan attempting to cook a stew over the fire. The results were questionable at best, and she couldn't help but laugh at his frustrated expression. I've faced down angry bulls with less fear than I feel looking at this pot, he admitted, stirring the dubious contents. Here, let me, Penelope offered, moving to his side. Their shoulders brushed as she took the wooden spoon from his hand, and she was suddenly aware of his closeness, of the scent of leather and horses that clung to him, of the warmth radiating from his body. I'd be much obliged, Ethan said softly, stepping back to give her space. Cooking was never my strong suit. Sarah used to say I could burn water if given the chance. The mention of his wife didn't sting, as it once might have. Instead, Penelope found herself curious. What was she like? She asked, adding salt to the stew and stirring it properly. Ethan sat at the small table, his expression softening with memory. She was fierce, he said after a moment, stubborn as the day is long, but with the kindest heart. She'd argue with me until we were both blue in the face, then turn around and nurse me through a fever without complaint. He smiled. She loved wildflowers, used to fill our cabin with them every spring. She sounds wonderful, Penelope said sincerely. She was. And your Matthew? Penelope stirred the stew, watching the fire dance beneath the pot. Quiet, she said. He didn't say much, but when he did speak, everyone listened. He had dreams bigger than Silver Creek, wanted to save enough from the mines to buy land in California, start an orchard. She felt tears prick her eyes. He loved growing things. Said there was something miraculous about planting a seed and watching it become food for our table. A man with vision, Ethan nodded. The best kind. They were quiet for a moment, each lost in their own memories. Then Ethan stood and moved to the small shelf where he kept his few possessions. He returned with a deck of cards. "My pa taught me that a good game of cards can lighten any mood," he said, shuffling the deck with practiced hands. "Do you play?" By the time the stew was ready, they were deep into a game of 5-card draw, and Penelope was winning more hands than she lost. They ate at the small table, continuing their game as the sky darkened outside and Ethan lit the lamps. It was only when Penelope yawned that she realized how late it had grown. "I should get home," she said, gathering her shawl. "It's not proper for me to be here so late." "Let me hitch up your wagon," Ethan offered, standing quickly. "It's too dark for you to drive home alone. I'll ride alongside to make sure you arrive safely." The night air was crisp as they made their way along the road to Penelope's cabin. Stars filled the sky above, and a waxing moon provided just enough light to see by. Neither spoke, but the silence was comfortable, wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. At her door, Ethan helped her down from the wagon. "Thank you for saving my supper," he said, his voice low in the quiet night, "and for the company." "Thank you for escorting me home," Penelope replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of his hand still holding hers from helping her down. For a brief moment, she thought he might lean closer, might bridge the small space between them, but instead, he stepped back, releasing her hand and tipping his hat. "Good night, Penelope." "Good night, Ethan." Inside her cabin, Penelope leaned against the closed door, her heart beating faster than the short walk from the wagon could account for. She touched her cheeks, feeling warmth there that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. "Matthew," she whispered to the empty room, "what's happening to me?" There was no answer, of course, just the quiet ticking of the clock and the soft sigh of the wind outside her window. The weeks passed, and Penelope found herself spending more and more time with Ethan. They fell into a routine of sorts. She would visit the livery in the afternoons, sometimes bringing food she had prepared, other times simply sitting on a bale of hay, watching him work with the horses and talking about their days. The town noticed, of course. Silver Creek was too small for any relationship to go unremarked upon. Some whispered that it was too soon after Matthew's death, while others, like Mrs. Henderson, nodded approvingly at the color that had returned to Penelope's cheeks. "You're breathing again," Mrs. Henderson told her one day, as Penelope selected fabric for a new shirt she was making for Ethan. "That's what matters." Breathing again. The phrase echoed in Penelope's mind as she walked to the livery that afternoon. It was true the crushing weight of grief had eased somewhat. She still thought of Matthew daily, still missed him with an ache that sometimes caught her by surprise, but the pain was no longer all-consuming. She found Ethan in the corral, working with a spirited mare that had arrived the previous day. He moved with the horse in a sort of dance, his voice low and soothing as he guided the animal around the enclosure. Penelope leaned on the fence, watching him work, admiring his patience and skill. When he finally noticed her, his face lit up with a smile that sent a now familiar warmth through her. "Penelope, I didn't see you there." "You were busy," she replied, nodding toward the mare. "She's beautiful." "She is," Ethan agreed, giving the horse a final pat before joining Penelope at the fence. "Though somewhat opinionated about being saddled." "Sounds like someone else I know," Penelope teased, thinking of their good-natured arguments about everything from how to properly cook beans to the merits of different authors. Ethan laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that Penelope had come to find endearing. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his expression growing more serious. "The harvest dance is this Saturday. I wondered if you might consider attending with me." The harvest dance. It would be Penelope's first public social event since Matthew's death. She hesitated, uncertainty clouding her thoughts. "I don't know, Ethan. People would talk." "People already talk," he pointed out gently. "The question is whether you're ready, not what others might say." Penelope thought about it. Was she ready to step back into the community in such a way? And with Ethan beside her, it felt like a declaration of sorts, an acknowledgement that life was indeed continuing. "Yes," she said finally, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Yes, I'd like to go to the dance with you." The night of the harvest dance arrived clear and cool, with stars shining brightly in the velvety sky. Penelope stood before her small mirror, adjusting the deep blue dress she had worn to only one previous dance, the spring social, where she and Matthew had announced their engagement. For a moment, guilt washed over her. Was it disloyal to wear this dress now, to another dance, with another man? But as she smoothed the fabric, she remembered Matthew's words when he'd first seen her in it. "You look like the sky at twilight, Penny. Like a promise of beauty to come." Perhaps it was right to wear it after all. A promise of beauty to come, even after the darkest night. A knock at the door announced Ethan's arrival. Penelope took a deep breath, steadying herself, then opened the door. Ethan stood on her porch, hat in hand, dressed in his best clothes, a clean white shirt, black vest, and trousers that had clearly been pressed for the occasion. His hair was neatly combed and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jaw, often hidden by stubble. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice soft with genuine admiration. "Thank you," Penelope replied, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "You clean up nicely yourself, Mr. Quinn." He offered his arm, and she took it, closing the door behind her. His wagon waited, the bay horse stamping impatiently in the cool evening air. The town hall was transformed for the occasion, with harvest decorations adorning the walls and tables laden with food prepared by the women of Silver Creek. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the proceedings, and a small band played lively tunes that had several couples already dancing. As Penelope entered on Ethan's arm, there was a brief lull in conversation, heads turning to observe the widow Turner and her companion. But Mrs. Henderson quickly approached, greeting them warmly and drawing them into the celebration, and soon the moment passed. "Would you care to dance?" Ethan asked as the band began a waltz. Penelope hesitated. Dancing seemed a step further than simply attending, a more public declaration of her changing heart. But Ethan's eyes held no pressure, only a gentle question she was free to answer as she chose. "I would," she said, placing her hand in his. He led her onto the floor, one hand resting lightly at her waist, the other clasping hers. As they began to move with the music, Penelope was surprised by how naturally they fell into step together, as if they had danced 100 times before. "You dance well," she commented, looking up at him. "Sarah insisted I learn," he replied with a small smile. "Said no husband of hers was going to shuffle around a dance floor like a bear with sore paws." The mention of his wife no longer created awkwardness between them. Instead, it felt like an acknowledgement of the path that had brought them to this moment, a recognition that their past loves were part of who they were now. "Matthew had 2 left feet," Penelope confided, remembering her husband's good-natured clumsiness. "But he tried so hard to please me." "A good man," Ethan said sincerely. "Yes, as was your James, I'm sure." They danced in comfortable silence after that, moving together around the floor, aware of but not concerned by the occasional glances from the townspeople. Later, as they took a break from dancing to enjoy some refreshments, Mayor Wilson approached them, his expression grave. "Mrs. Turner, Mr. Quinn," he greeted them. "I'm glad to see you both this evening." "Mayor," Ethan nodded respectfully. "I wanted to let you know, Mrs. Turner, that there's been some progress regarding the Silver Star mine," Mayor Wilson said, his voice low enough that only they could hear. "They've managed to clear some of the collapse, and they've begun recovering remains." Penelope felt the room spin slightly, and Ethan's hand was immediately at her elbow, steadying her. "Matthew?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Not yet," the mayor said gently. "But I thought you should know they're making progress. When they do find him, you'll be notified immediately, of course." After the mayor moved on, Penelope stood frozen, the cup of punch in her hand forgotten. The music and laughter around her seemed distant, muffled by the sudden rush of grief that washed over her anew. "Let's step outside," Ethan suggested, carefully taking the cup from her hand and setting it aside. "Get some air." The night air was crisp and clean, a welcome contrast to the warmth and noise of the dance. Penelope leaned against a post on the town hall's porch, taking deep breaths to steady herself. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I thought I was stronger than this." "No need to apologize," Ethan replied, standing beside her but not too close, giving her space. "Grief doesn't follow rules or timelines. It comes and goes on its own schedule." Penelope looked up at him, at the understanding in his eyes, and felt a surge of gratitude for this man who had somehow become so important to her in such a short time. "Thank you, Ethan." "For what?" "For helping me breathe again," she said simply, echoing Mrs. Henderson's words. "For reminding me that life continues, even when it feels impossible. Ethan's expression softened, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You've done the same for me, Penelope, more than you know." In that moment, standing in the quiet darkness with the sounds of the dance muffled behind them, Penelope recognized the truth of her feelings. She cared deeply for Ethan Quinn. It wasn't a betrayal of Matthew's memory, but rather a testament to the capacity of the human heart to heal, to expand, to love again. The realization brought not guilt, but a sense of peace. Matthew would have wanted her to find happiness again, just as she imagined Sarah would have wanted Ethan to move forward with his life. "Should we return to the dance?" Ethan asked after a moment. Penelope considered the question, then shook her head. "Would you mind taking me home? I think I've had enough excitement for one evening." "Of course." The ride back to Penelope's cabin was quiet but comfortable. When they arrived, Ethan helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight," he said, standing close in the silver moonlight. "I hope the mayor's news doesn't cause you too much distress." "It was a reminder," Penelope admitted. "But not all reminders are painful. Sometimes they help us recognize how far we've come." She looked up at him, gathering her courage.